All right, Sarah. So this one, this was a sweet one, and we talked to Professor Susie Swithers about sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, right?
Artificial sweeteners and how they compare to regular old sugar. And well, I don't want to give too much away, right? No spoilers, but it's interesting.
Yep, can't tell them all. Can't tell them all because I want to listen to it. But yeah, it's very interesting. She told us the names of different sweeteners. I love that, and the different and how they determine it's a sweetener. I'm gonna make you listen for that one.
Right.
Wasn't what I thought. And so different sweeteners, and even threw in some side effects of different things like this, and he gave us suggestions on here what to do. I gotta admit it, did not like those suggestions at all. They felt a little too close to home, and telling me I can't have all my sweet stuff. I don't like hearing that, but it makes sense. It definitely makes sense to be better in the long run. Welcome to Superheroes of Science. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Sarah. We co-host Science from the Experts. Our guests are professionals doing cutting-edge science right now.
They're experts in their field discussing what they know best. So listen up and learn real science from real people.
Subscribe now and stay informed of our latest episodes and show your support.
Joining us today on Superheroes of Science, we are pleased to welcome Susie Swithers. Susie is the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Health and Human Sciences and also a professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences here at Purdue University. So welcome and thank you so much for being here.
I'm happy to be here.
We know, especially with those titles, that you're a very busy person and probably not easy to pin down these days. And so we really appreciate you taking time to share some of your expertise with us and the world.
Well, I like to. I think that's one of the fun things about doing science is when you can get out of the lab and sort of explain to people, hey, you know, what we're doing here might actually matter, even though it's sometimes kind of a curvy road till you get to that point.
Well, that's fair enough. That's now for you. One of the things we're going to talk about is the artificial sweeteners with you. Now, is this something you've been doing research in for some time now?
Yeah, so believe it or not, it's been a little over 15 years since we first started to look into artificial sweeteners. They have lots of names. So artificial sweeteners, high intensity sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners, they all mean slightly different things. And I tend to use them interchangeably, but you know, they're a little different from one another.
Fair enough. Now, I guess, I mean, heck, 15 years ago, the only thing I knew that had them maybe was diet drinks.
Yeah, so for a long time, up until probably about the mid 90s, that was the primary place that you found them. One of the big things that happened to change that was the introduction of a high intensity sweetener called sucralose. And sucralose is better known by most people as the sweetener in Splenda. And one of the big differences between Splenda and earlier sweeteners is that Splenda is relatively heat stable. So earlier sweeteners like aspartame or saccharin, if you try to bake with them, for example, they don't survive that process very well. So they're no longer sweet. So the biggest market was in beverages, which were primarily served cold. Sucralose, because it's more heat stable, now it could be put into all kinds of products.
With the invention of sucralose then so you're saying that's kind of when then we started seeing it expand into other products?
That's right. So before then, as I said, it was mostly in beverages. Now it's in everything. And so I sort of joke that you have to have a PhD to be able to identify all the products that contain these high intensity sweeteners. There have been instances in which the products have made their way into my house, and that isn't because people weren't looking, just because they didn't quite know. So, for example, there are English muffins, high protein English muffins that have both sucrose, which is regular table sugar, and sucralose as an ingredient.
I feel like they try to trick us into getting this stuff. because those names, I have to ask my wife all the time, like, all right, what is this? And she's like, no. And so, okay.
Right. And so there in the US, there are, 6 or 7. I don't do the counting. The FDA has approved a relatively small number of these products. So I can just tell you what those are if people want to be able to look on a label. So saccharin has been around for a long time. It's the sweetener that's used in Sweet and Low. Aspartame is another one, which is the sweetener that's in NutraSweet. And just to kind of give some context here. So saccharin is somewhere between 207 times sweeter than sugar. Aspartame is around 200. There is a sweetener called asulfame potassium. That's a sweetener that's about 200 times sweeter than sugar. It's usually not used on its own. So many of the high intensity sweeteners are in combination. So you'll find asulfame potassium, or ACE-K as we refer to it. It's usually combined with another sweetener. So it's typically not by itself. And then sucralose, which is Splenda, which is somewhere around 600 times sweeter than sugar. There are a couple of relatively newer sweeteners. They're not in very many products that we know of, but they're so sweet that theoretically, if they're in a product, they might be in such small quantities that they would not need to appear on the label based on the FDA requirements. And those include neotame, which is somewhere between 7,000 and 13,000 times sweeter than sugar, and advantame, which is about 20,000 times sweeter than sugar. So part of the way these things work is that they're just much sweeter than sugar. So they're in the products in really tiny amounts, which is why they effectively don't give you any calories. Then there are also other kinds of sweeteners that are not technically FDA approved, but they've gone through a process that's known as generally recognized as safe. So these are plant-derived sweeteners. So they're plant extracts that have been concentrated. And those include things that come from stevia plants. So stevia may be something that people are familiar with. There are really a few different glycosides that are derived from stevia that have been allowed into food products through this GRAS process. And that includes something called rebaudioside A, or Reb A, that's how it'll often show up on the label, or stevioside or rebaudioside D. Sometimes it'll say a stevia extract. So those are somewhere between 200 and 400 times as sweet as sugar. And then there are also monk fruit extracts, which can show up either as monk fruit extract, or there's a Chinese name, which I'm blocking on and will probably mispronounce anyway. I think, yeah, so I don't want to do that because I don't want to say something unintentionally offensive. But they might also be labeled as Mogricide 5, and that's somewhere between 100 and 250 times sweeter.
Now, you keep saying that it's so much like 200 times sweeter than sugar, but how is that decided that it is? I mean, obviously there's some kind of test or benchmark. It's not you're just having somebody like Sarah and Steven test things like, oh yeah. So,
well, yeah, believe it or not, there are actually sensory panels there are people who have expertise. They're trained to be sensory testers for all kinds of things, including for, foods. And so what happens is that you kind of train people using sucrose solutions to, here's this is what, a 10% solution looks like. This is what it tastes like. And each individual person will then get trained to do this. And then you can give them these sweeteners, and then you ask them, give them different concentrations. You have them kind of match, like, how sweet does this taste to you? And they'll be able to say, oh, this tastes like a 20% solution, that kind of thing. So that's also why there are ranges, because these sweeteners, the way they interact with our sweet taste receptors is different from the way other sugar, real sugars do. And individual people have differences in their ability, the extent to which they respond to the different sweeteners. So it's not an exact science, but that's why you get these sort of ranges.
I think that is so fascinating that it's the way that it appears on your tongue, and then it sends those messages then to your brain. And how is that different with these artificial sweeteners compared to just normal sugar?
They're just, so we have sweet taste receptors. This is the other thing that's really sort of fascinating. 25 years ago, we thought we only had sweet taste receptors on our tongue. And it turns out that they're everywhere in our body. They're in our tongues, they're in our intestines, they're in our pancreas,
Intestines.
Yes. And so one of the ideas behind these sweeteners originally is like, the only place that they're going to produce any effect is on your tongue, because that's the only place you have the receptors. So the reason why they work so well is they're just much better at binding to these receptors. So they use some of the same processes that sugar would. It's just that they can make that receptor, respond at a much lower concentration than sugar requires. They sort of fit into the binding pockets of the receptors and turn them on. It takes 1/200th as much for Splenda to do that compared to sucrose.
Now,
So if you get the little packets, sorry to interrupt, Stephen, but if you have a little packet of these things, if you look at the ingredients carefully, what you'll see is that it's typically, the first ingredient listed is typically something like maltodextrin or dextrose, which is either a starch or a sugar, and then the sweetener. And that's because the amount that you need is so tiny that if you put that in the packet, and people ripped it open, they could spill it on the table, or they would say there's nothing in here. It's a really tiny amount. So most of what's in those packets is the filler that allows you to empty out the sweetener and mix it in. Stephen, I love your face. You're just like,
that just blows my mind.
I know, it does. Because I've opened those sweet and low, there's all the different colors at diners and things. And you think, it's in here, I want to see. And they all look like they have the same amounts.
Well, and they do, because they have the filler in them. And so the filler has obviously been mixed together with the sweetener so that they're not separating from one another. But if you go, I know that with Splenda, that there are the baking versions where you can buy a bag where you can scoop it and measure it the same way. Well, that's mostly filler with just a tiny little bit of the sweetener.
I feel like I've been conned. And then part of me is just amazed that you're telling me such a little teeny fraction of that is the actual sweetener. But part of me is just amazed that something that small could sweeten compatibly to my sugar.
Well, and I mentioned already, acesulfame is a sweetener that's very rarely on its own in a product. And that's because even though they mimic they mimic sugars, none of them are exactly like sugar. And so sugar itself has, not only is its sweetness sort of perceptibly different, there's sort of a roundness and the time it takes for you to taste the sweetness and how long it lasts differs between sugar and these other sweeteners. And so that's sometimes why they're combined, is because they each bind with the receptors slightly differently. And they all also have, kind of an extra or off taste almost. And so sometimes they're combined with one another to sort of allow blotting out or minimizing those kind of off tastes. So some of them may have a metallic taste or a bitter taste or sort of, kind of almost like a licorice taste. And that's sort of why they end up mixed together, is to balance that out.
My mom and I have commented before, just trying different things like that kind of has a bitter taste to it. So it's nice to hear that it's not just us.
No, it's not just you.
So how is our brain, or how are we perceiving these differences then? And what's it doing to our bodies? I don't know what we can say. I'm not sure what to ask exactly.
Yeah. So work in my lab has been, we've used an animal model. We use rats for lots of reasons, primarily because our animals, I know for certain, have never had experience with these sweeteners before we give it to them. And at this point, if you're an adult in the US, the chances that you've never had exposure to one of these things is really small. So one of the things we haven't talked about is that these sweeteners show up in toothpaste, for example. And so there's a study that was done by other people, some colleagues of mine, that actually looked at blood levels of sucralose in breast milk of women. And they asked the women whether or not they consumed high intensity sweeteners, and sucralose was showing up in the breast milk, even of women who said that they didn't use them. Oh. And so one suspicion would be that it might, for example, be in their toothpaste, or perhaps they're chewing sugarless gum, things that people don't think about because they're not consciously consuming them, but where you could end up having, some of it end up in your body. So we like to use animals because we have much better control over what they're doing. And so not just my lab, but in other labs, we found, have found lots of what you might call unexpected consequences of consuming these. So the general idea was that they would taste really sweet and they wouldn't deliver any energy or calories. And so that would be a good thing. But there's an old commercial that says it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. And so, how did a psychologist start to look at artificial sweeteners? Well, one of the most famous things that people know about in psychology is often Pavlov, and how, Pavlov's dogs would salivate in response to things like a bell that predicted that they were going to get food. So Pavlov was not really a psychologist, but he discovered principles that are very fundamental to psychology. He was a digestive physiologist, and what he laid out was that we learn about the consequences of eating food, and our brains produce these reactions that are designed to help us digest our food. So the reason that a dog starts to salivate when it thinks food is coming is because saliva contains enzymes that help it break down its food. And there are all kinds of other less visible reactions beyond salivation. There are hormones that are released. You actually can see that people's body temperature goes up a little bit because you actually have to expend energy to get the energy out of your food. So we refer to all of these reactions as cephalic phase responses. They're responses to food that happen before you actually get it into your stomach and your intestines. And so we were interested in the question of, well, what happens when you get a cue like this tastes sweet that has always been followed by sugar and energy? So your brain is like, okay, I'm going to get this. You're prepared. You release hormones. You get ready for energy. Well, now you introduce one of these sweeteners. Your mouth says, ooh, this is sweet. Sugar and energy is about to show up. And then it doesn't. And so what we know about learning is that if you present this cue and it's not followed by what it's supposed to be followed by, then your body makes adjustment. It's like, wait a minute, I thought that sugar was going to show up, but I didn't get any energy and I didn't get any calories. Maybe sweet taste's not such a great cue anymore. So, if Pavlov rang the bell and then stopped giving the food, then eventually the dogs didn't salivate. They waited till the food showed up. And so we think that's the same kind of thing. Certainly in our animals, we can demonstrate that what happens is that once you've had experience with these high intensity sweeteners, your response to regular sugars is not as strong or as big as it used to be. So that's where the issue comes in, is that we have sometimes the sweet taste is followed by energy, and it would be really helpful for us to know that. We can gear up our metabolism, we can release the appropriate hormones, but sometimes it isn't. And if we've done that and then the sugar doesn't show up, our bodies has to kind of scramble to then do that. So the evidence that we have from my lab, it suggests that that's kind of what happens, is that once the animals have gotten this experience with the high intensity sweeteners, their responses to real sugar are not as strong or as fast as animals who've never had the artificial sweetener. It's more difficult to directly ask those kinds of questions in people. So we don't know whether that happens in people or not. But if you look at kind of long-term studies in people, and most of these have been done in people who are drinking diet beverages, because that's really where they were at least up until 15 to 20 years ago. So there are studies that have followed cohorts of people. Now, it's important to understand these aren't experimental studies, and so there are lots of things that could differ. But if you look at people who say that they do drink diet sodas, and this is typically at least one a day, and you compare them to people who said they don't drink diet sodas, and you follow them out over 10, 15, 20 years, the diet soda consumers have been shown to be at increased risk for things like the development of diabetes, heart disease, stroke, dementia. So the human data in diet soda consumers doesn't really show any evidence that they're kind of helping people avoid these problems later in life. And instead they suggest that they might be, increasing the risk for developing these same things in a way that's very similar to what we know about what regular sodas do. So my take-home message, people always ask me, well, is it better if I drink a regular soda or a diet soda? And the answer is no. So, that's part of the other thing that's happened is that, when I was a kid, having a soda every day we didn't do that. But I think it's pretty clear that having a soda every day is not a healthy lifestyle. That doesn't mean, we shouldn't ever have, a sweetened beverage, but we shouldn't really be having sweetened beverages every single day. It's probably not great.
It's a treat. It's a treat.
Yes. And I like to make the analogy of most adults wouldn't sit down to dinner and pour out a bag of, Skittles, for example, on their plate, right? Mm-hmm. So most adults would be like, yeah, you don't have like a candy bar with your dinner, but that's really what a soda is. It's a candy in a can. And so filling it, so it's just, we tend not to think about them that way. And so I suspect that's how we sort of crept into the point where people are walking around, drinking these things.
Okay, psychologically, because holiday time, first of the year time, stuff like that, and that's where we are now. We'll get ready, stepping into a holiday, and we're getting ready to. People will be making resolutions, and I think there's an official resolution quitter day or something like that, and, I think it's in the first month or something. But it's if I'm someone who drinks a lot of sugar, and I want to stop that, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll switch over to diet drinks because that'll help me break my sugar habit. Well, now we're going to potentially have bad health problems down the road because of those. What psychologically, it's like I feel like that addiction is there. And I can say that because I am so totally addicted to sugar. I'm not talking about someone else. I'm talking about Stephen. Everyone I work with brings candy for me because they know Steve's getting grumpy. But psychologically, how does a person go about breaking that pattern. It's like you said, how do we turn that into, okay, instead of stopping for a pop every day on the way to work or on the way home or whatever, how do we psychologically condition ourselves not to do that? Because it seems like if we just break something off, we go back to it so much harder.
Right. And I think that that's part of it is not thinking about never having the stuff. Because if you make something forbidden, then it becomes more attractive. And like everything else, it's all about the amounts. So, part of the way I think about it now is that for us to kind of, as a society, make progress on this is really a policy level issue. So it's very difficult to go out and find foods that do not have really high levels of sugar or one of these sweeteners in it. And so I mentioned, high protein English muffins. Not blueberry muffins, not like something that we would normally think of being sweet, but our food supply is so sweetened that we now have to have the sucralose in these things to meet our palates. So one of the things that tends to happen is that most people think that they eat what they like, but it turns out you like what you eat. So as you become familiar with something, so here's a good example of this. If I were to bring in a container of Vegemite, would you be really excited? No, like most, Americans are just like, oh, that sounds gross. Nevertheless, there are lots of people who love it. And there are people who love it because that's what they're accustomed to eating. It's part of their culture. So food is incredibly cultural. And so we like what we eat. So one of the things that would happen, so the best thing would be go cold turkey. Say, I'm going to, for 5 days, I'm not going to have any sodas, right? On the 6th day, my guess is when you take a sip of the soda, you're going to be like, wow, this is really sweet. There is this sort of desensitization. That's not always an option. So there are other things that you could potentially try. One is, a lot of people, they find the first couple sips of their soda really pleasurable, but then they just drink the whole thing because it's there.
Yeah.
So what you could do is be like, okay, I'm going to have a couple of sips of this, and then I'm dumping the rest of it down the drain. That produces two things. It sort of satisfies you in the moment, and then you're throwing away a lot of money. And you may eventually go, wow, why am I spending all this money just for a couple of sips? And it may be gradual, or it may be the case that you get to the point where you're having a couple of sips 3 times a day and you don't care that you're dumping the rest of it down the drain, but at least you're not getting as much of it. But I have not tested this experimentally, so I can't give you any data on how well this works. But I do think people are sensitive to things like, how much does this cost? How much money am I spending on this? So even if you don't decide to change your habits, just track, how much money am I spending on this thing? And how much of my time am I spending on acquiring this thing? So, but I think that part of it really is just, deciding what do you want to be doing, right? What do you want to be eating and drinking? So are diet sodas responsible for the entire epidemic of obesity and diabetes worldwide? Of course not, right? But they're not necessarily a particularly good solution either. So, there are some data in people, for example, where they've done things like they've asked people to drink an extra liter of soda a day, people who don't drink soda. And then they're in an experiment and they're given a liter of soda to drink every single day. Well, it turns out if you do that for 6 weeks, the outcome is much worse if it's got sugar in it than if it's a diet soda. So in a short term, it's pretty clear that we can demonstrate that there are circumstances in which drinking regular soda is going to produce worse effects than drinking diet soda. That doesn't mean the diet soda is good for you. It just means that But I think the real message is don't drink a liter of soda a day. I mean, these just, yeah. So, as you roll into, maybe you want to make some changes. Some of it's just about being thoughtful and not automatically assuming that because it's diet, that it's necessarily healthy. I certainly do not make the healthiest dietary choices under every circumstance. It's just, okay, I know what I'm doing here. I understand. And people take pleasure out of these things. Food is supposed to be pleasurable, we're supposed to enjoy it. So we don't want to have to overthink everything we do. But I do think that if somebody's at a point where they're drinking, 1 or 2 sweetened beverages every single day, that's maybe something where it's like, okay, why am I doing this? Is it a habit? Do I need to drink the whole thing? Can I just get away with having a couple sips of it? And if you can, make it through 5 days without having a hyper sweetened beverage and being attentive to how much added sugars in the rest of your diet, you might find that the next time you taste the thing that you thought was amazing, you're like, wow, this is really this is too sweet for me. So kind of training your tongue to be like, okay, I don't need as much sweet as I thought to.
And I know that's definitely what I found when I got off the pop, because I was one of those people that drank, more than a liter every day for a while. And it was tough to get off of that and it's with the ice water and stuff. But even today, when some of us went out for lunch, I thought I'm going to have some sweet tea for my lunch today. I'm just going to do it. And I thought, man, this stuff is thick. It's like, I need to dilute this. And so I'm looking for the unsweet side, because I'm like, this is way too much. Well,
right.
It wasn't too long ago, it was just it.
Yep.
Portions for me, it's all about because I'm tracking calories because I'm trying to, hit certain marks and stuff. And
yep.
I'm stingy with because I know portions now, if you get a small, but like today's, the small beverage was 24 ounces.
Yeah.
That was the small. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're talking almost 400 calories if I did a pop or that sweet tea, and I could eat quite a bit of good stuff for 400 calories.
I have a Parks and Recreation slide. And basically the Parks and Recreation slide, for people who are not aware, Parks and Recreation is a show that was set in a fictional town in Indiana. And so we like to work Parks and Recreation references in whenever we can. And the town council is having a meeting where they're discussing regulating beverages, taxing sweetened beverages. And so Leslie Knope, who is the main character, is discussing this, and she's got a display of cups in front of her. And the regular size, it says regular, and it's 128 ounces. And then there's a child size that's 512 ounces. And someone asks her why it's a child size. And the answer is because that's the volume that, if you blended a toddler, that's. But that's part of the issue, is that portion sizes are absolutely enormous. And that's one of the factors that contributes to why people have so much trouble, regulating healthy amounts of food intake, because we are given, enough food for 3 or 4 meals often as a single meal.
We're really good at justifying.
Yeah.
For me, it's like, oh, the healthy drinks are too expensive. I can go across the street and get a 44 ounce for 59 cents a pop. I'll just do that. And then it's like, once I started getting stingy with my budget and talking to myself, all right, quit justifying what you want. I'm like, oh, the water's free.
Yeah. Well, and you can there are ways to make water more interesting. So for example, you can just buy frozen whole fruit and use that as your ice cube. And so it's not the same as a soda, but it does have some flavor to it. And then as the, ice cubes melt at the end, you've got, some strawberries you can munch on, or some pineapple, or whatever your kind of fruit. I wouldn't, grapes because they've got the skin on them, probably are not going to provide much flavor until you eat them. But I know a lot of people think water is boring. And you can definitely steep your water in the fruits. But that reminds me to say that we talk about soft drinks or sodas or pops, but fruit juices themselves are not necessarily a great option either. They're really high sugar. They're not much different than an actual carbonated soda. And you can kind of prove this to yourself if you're doing like, fresh squeezed orange juice. Compare how many oranges did you squeeze to get that glass of juice? And would you ever sit down and eat 6 whole oranges at one time? Probably not, but you can down those,
Oh, yeah.
in a minute. So doesn't mean you should never have fruit juice, but it means you shouldn't pretend fruit juice is somehow magically good in the same way that whole fruit is.
With my kids, I get after them. They want to grab the largest cup in the cabinet and fill that cup all the way up with their juice. But Mom, it's breakfast and it's my juice. But we have these small little juice cups that have plenty. That's plenty of juice that you need. Sometimes I tell them, we'll just cut it with water, put some water in it, and then that's so it's. But I wanted to ask about the how we were talking about the artificial sweeteners. How do we have the when we have had artificial sweeteners? So in the past, I know I've had something that's been artificially sweetened. I don't normally choose that. Is there a way that is there a time span that goes by that then that kind of cancels out? Like maybe it resets us, or is it, no, we've had it once and it's just kind of cumulative?
And I can't answer that question.
Okay.
So we haven't explicitly looked at that very much depth in our animal models. But part of the reason why I think that they are likely to be more of a concern, regardless of how frequently you have them, is that this kind of interfering with potential learnings, not the only mechanism by which they could produce problems. So other people have looked in animal models, as well as to some extent in people, and shown a variety of changes that are not necessarily related to learning. So for example, they seem to alter the kinds of bacteria that are in our gut, the gut microbiome. And so that is something that we have only really recently begun to understand how important those bacteria that live in our guts are for healthy, for lots of aspects of our health. So they do seem to potentially alter your gut bacteria. There are other mechanisms that involve possibly changing the activity of enzymes in our guts that in a system that may prevent us from having something called leaky gut. So our intestines are designed to absorb nutrients, but to keep some other things out. And so if you damage the integrity of the intestine, then you can get things that you've eaten, things in your diet that you don't want in your body, those can end up inside of your body. So there are other possible mechanisms here. And when we start to talk about in people, as I mentioned, the original idea was that you would taste these things, but they really wouldn't interact with anything else. It's kind of you taste them and then you just get rid of them. But as we've learned more about where sweet taste receptors are actually located, there's evidence in humans that, especially if you do something like have a diet soda just before you get an oral glucose tolerance test. And what an oral glucose tolerance test is a way to figure out whether or not you have diabetes, whether your body is able to produce and respond to the hormone insulin. So insulin's a hormone that you need in order to get the sugar from your diet out of your blood. So we want to keep your blood sugar levels at an appropriate level. And if you don't produce enough insulin, or if your body's not sensitive enough to it, then you ultimately get diabetes. And so an oral glucose tolerance test, what happens is that people drink a specific amount of glucose, and then you measure the sugar, the glucose in their blood after certain periods of time. And so what's been shown is that people, if you give people a diet soda just before an oral glucose tolerance test, then that can actually affect things like how much insulin is produced, which is kind of wild, right? So if these are things that are inert and just go through your body, then why is that happening? So we strongly suspect that these sweeteners are doing something in the immediate aftermath, and that they're potentially affecting how you're responding to the other foods that you're having, even at the same time. So I think that, answering the question of, if I haven't had them in a while, has the learning gone away? Well, we don't know. But even if you haven't had them in a while, they're likely to be producing some of these other consequences.
Very interesting. This is really neat.
Now, when people at your house bake and it calls for sugar in a recipe, do you put real sugar in?
Of course.
Okay.
So I personally,
you said you don't have fake sugars in your house.
That's right. I personally have just never liked the taste of them. I for whatever reason, I'm incredibly sensitive to the presence of them. And so I just never use them for that reason. And then once I started to do this work, it's like, well, based on what I know, there's not really any benefit to using them. And so, I feel like the science sort of tells us that if you're using sweeteners, whether we're talking about sugar or the artificial ones, in appropriate amounts, it probably doesn't matter which one you're choosing. Okay. So if you're limiting your sweet food and sweet beverage intake, that means that you're not having, a sweetened beverage every single day, much less with every meal. Then it may not matter which of these. And if you're consuming too much sweet food, it may not matter whether it's sugar or one of these. So again, it's all about amount. So I always bake with real sugar. I have a couple of kind of funny attributes. My kids are older now, but they definitely wanted to avoid circumstances in which mom was going to be confronted with a high intensity sweetener. But there are a couple of sort of funny things that have happened to me. So in order to do some of the work, I have to be fitted for a real N95 mask. And so everyone knows what an N95 is, but for them to be 95% efficient, they actually have to fit your face. And they're different, and we are all much more aware of this than we probably would like to be at this point. And so there is an office on Purdue's campus that's part of the occupational safety. And so you go over and they put a mask on you, and they spray something. So you've got this sort of hood on, and they put a spray inside and they ask you to breathe in. And if it's working, if the mask is well fitted to your face, then you don't taste or smell anything because it's kept out by the mask. And so the first mask that was put on me is just kind of a standard style. It did not fit. And no one told me that they were spraying saccharin on me. So it didn't fit, and I was able to taste it, and I had this just sort of visceral, oh, wow, what have you done to me? kind of thing. Yeah. So, and it was all over my hair and everything. So I was sort of tasting saccharin for a very long time. Yeah. So, and then more recently, I actually went out to dinner and ordered a dessert. And, it was like a regular dessert. There was no indication that I was doing anything other than ordering a cake with some strawberries and sauce. And I took one taste of it and I was like, this has got an artificial sweetener in it. And so me being me, I promised my name's not Karen, but I didn't send it back. I just was like, can you, tell me whether there's a high into, an artificial sweetener in this. And so they went back to the kitchen and came back and said, yeah, there is. And I was like, no, you might want to just label that. And I swear I was still tasting that sweetener like half an hour later. And that could be, that could be in my head, but it also could just be the case that it is so potent and they bind so strongly to our receptors that I really was continuing to taste it. So yeah, I'm a lot of fun to go out to dinner with. Don't try to put the diet soda in front of me, because I for whatever reason, I just have this very visceral negative reaction to it.
My wife, with one of them, she says it makes her heart race. She says she can taste it and it makes her heart race. And so,
yeah, and it's certainly possible. I don't know that I would want to lay my life on the line that I could do this 100% of the time, but anecdotally, I'm pretty good at just recognizing whether they're in there or not. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like I said, scary part is it's kind of everywhere now. It's more and
It
more.
is. Right.
More and more. It's where it's whether it's the artificial sweeteners or the regular sugars. It seems like the diet is getting more sweeter and sweeter because the people's palate requires more and more sweetness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's hard to have the time to make your own foods. I mean, it is difficult. And so that's part of the reason why, I had said that we may be at the point where this is kind of a policy issue. And so if you look at other countries, like the UK, for example, where they tax products that have more than a certain amount of added sugar, or, you kind of provide incentives for companies to produce food that is lower in some of these things. But of course, what often happens is when they remove sugar, they add the artificial sweeteners, which may, it solves one problem, but may introduce completely different ones.
Wow. I see why you say neither one's the option.
Right. So mostly, drink water, minimize the amount of highly sweetened stuff that you're consuming. Be conscious of it. And as I said, this is supposed to be pleasurable. And so just be aware of what we're doing. I think that we have, the thing that's happened is that we have such ready access to food and beverage all the time that a lot of it is mindless. We're just doing it because it's there, or because we're bored, or because we're avoiding doing something. It's like, I really should write this email, or I really should grade those papers. It's like, oh, I know, I'll walk to the vending machine instead.
That's my life right there. I mean, I feel like you're lecturing me all of a sudden. How'd you know?
How did you know?
We're all there.
Yeah.
That's my main avoidance mechanism. Oh, I need a snack.
Susie, thank you so much for all of this information. This was wonderful.
Oh, good. Yeah. And I hope people learn stuff. And, I'm not the food police. My main goal is just for people to understand that we've certainly been marketed to believe that the diet versions are good options. And I think that it's fair to say they're not necessarily good options. And it doesn't mean you should never, ever have one of them. But, there are lots of things that we know that are not good for us, and we choose to do them anyway. And I think that that people should have those options. People should be able to choose to do things that they know are not so great for them, but they need to know that they're not so great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Science from the Experts from Purdue University Superheroes of Science.
If you like this episode, subscribe, give us a positive review, and share the love. Boiler up!
Hammer down.